Good morning, church.
Good morning.
Hey, someone name that tune for me. Scotland the Brave. Thank you. I knew there had to be a Scotsman in the crowd somewhere. It's all going to make sense by the time I'm done. So first of all, I want to just welcome you all here and thank you for welcoming me back. Some of you are saying, Pastor Mark, where have you been? You've been missing in action. No, I've been missing in inaction. There's a difference. And those of you that have been around long enough know this, that every January I take the whole month off from preaching and I do a study leave. And this year I have managed to complete the manuscript for my third book. And I'm very excited about it. And so book 1 was a greater purpose, book 2 was a greater passion, book 3 is a greater perspective. Secrets of Success from the Sermon on the Mount. Love alliteration. And I spent 30 days every single day in the Sermon on the Mount, those 3 chapters in the book of Matthew. And I'm telling you, I can't imagine a more rich experience than spending 30 days in the Sermon on the Mount. And even if none of you like the book, you know what? It has changed me forever. I'm a way better person than I used to be. I know what you're thinking, well, we'll believe it when we see it. Which would be fair enough. It absolutely would. So let me first of all welcome you in person. Let me welcome all of those that are joining us online across our city, across our nation, and of course around the world. And then our campuses, North End, Bronx Park, Niverville, and the gang out in Morris, Manitoba. Let's give them all a big shout. So this morning I'm beginning a new series called Caring for Your Caln. And of course, you all know that this is Family Month. Every year we take a whole month and we do nothing but family, and we talk about family, we preach about family, and we journey together around family. And the reason we take a whole month for this is, let me tell you right at the outset, there is nothing more important in God's heart than the family. It was his first creation, the very first thing that he did. Before there was governments, before there was kings, before there was even the law, before there was a place of worship, there was a family. And let me paint the picture for you so we understand how important this was. Genesis 1:1, God creates the heavens and the earth. Everything that we see, the universe out there, the solar systems and the galaxies beyond that, 13.67 billion light years from one end to the other, with billions of stars, galaxies, and solar systems. And then in our solar system, he makes this little planet, the little blue planet, third from the sun. And he starts renovating this planet, unlike the other planets that we know of anyway. And he's got rivers and streams, and he's got mountains and valleys, and he's got, starts to put in trees and grass. And then he starts adding the animals and the fish and the birds of the air. And then he builds a garden right in the middle of this planet. And in this garden, he goes right to the middle of the garden and he digs up some dirt. And out of the dirt, he makes man. Boy, this explains a lot about your husband, doesn't it, women? It's already making sense for many of you. And then the first thing he says to the man is, it's not good for man to be alone. And he takes out the rib and he fashions the woman and he brings him the woman. And then to them he says this, here's my mission for you. Here was God's grand scheme, the family. And he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. That was the first commandment. And really, the only one we've really been able to keep, right? How are we doing at that one? How are we doing? We are nailing this one. 8 billion people later, we have multiplied and filled the earth. Of course, I always say that I think sex is God's way of tricking us into having children. Would we otherwise? And here's what I don't want you to miss. That the very, 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 very first thing he did was he created a family, because it's the first and the foremost. There's nothing more important in this world than the family. And I don't know how you picture that scene in the garden when God brought Eve to Adam, but here's how I saw it. And see, I don't think he would have known what to do with her, right? And so he went to the Lord and he said, Lord, what do you want me to do? He said, well, go give her a hug. He says, Lord, what's a hug? So he explains to him what a hug is. So he goes over and gives Eve a hug. And 1 minute later, he comes back and says, that was pretty good. And the Lord says, well, go give her a kiss. He says, well, Lord, what's a kiss? So he explains it to him. He goes over and gives her a kiss and comes back and says, 1 minute later, it says, that was even better than a hug. He said, well, you're going to like what comes up next. He says, I want you to go make love to her. And he says, Lord, what's making love? So he explains it to him. So he goes over there. 1 minute later, he's back and says, Lord, what's a headache? That might be made up. And so my series is called Caring for Your Clan, and my message is specifically this week is, who is your clan? And when we think of clans, I know what most of you think of. Most of you probably think of the Scottish Highlands. And in the Scottish Highlands, you have these clans, and they're groups of families that have come together under a family name, and they're either connected by marriage or by blood. And you probably could all remember the names. They're the McGregors and the McDermotts and the MacArthurs and the McEachrons, and you know these Scottish names. And in the old days, these clans used to live together, they used to work together, and they used to fight and go to battle together. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. And today, of course, they're not at war, fortunately, but they do have the Highland Games. And some of you maybe have seen pictures of the Highland Games, and they come together, and the clans compete one against another, and they do goofy things like throw poles and see how far they can, or the tug of war. His picture of the tug of war. And there's these guys yanking away, and you see those tartans, right? Those kilts, and that's their clan tartan. And each clan has a specific tartan that is unique to them, and God help you if you wear another clan's tartan. It's very important, and if you talk to any Scotsman, they will tell you that very same thing. And you know, it's a funny thing about the Scots. I mean, the Brits are a proud bunch. But any group of guys that is willing to go out in public in a skirt is taking pride to a whole new level. And you know why they call them kilts, don't you? Because I killed the last guy who called it a skirt. You got that, didn't you? And so when we think of clans, we often think of the Scots, but in fact, the clan is a biblical concept, and the word clan in the Hebrew language appears, are you ready for this, 224 times in the Old Testament. 224 times he uses the word clans. Most of the time it's translated as families, plural. But there's one verse in particular that you all know and you're familiar with that I think I'm going to just reference because I think it'll really help you understand this. And it's the story of Gideon. And you, of course, remember Gideon in Judges chapter 6, and there he was threshing wheat in the bottom of the winepress because the land had been overrun by the Mennonites, the Midianites. Why do I slip up on that every single time? And God appears to him and says, go in this might of yours, and you will defeat the Midianites as one man. And he says this is the quote. He says, how can I save Israel? He says, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And of course, here's what we know about Gideon, that he suffered from an extraordinary inferiority complex. But one thing was clear, he actually knew who he was. He knew where he came from, he knew what his nationality was, he knew what his clan was, he knew what his family was. I'm going to throw it up on the screen because I want to walk this through so you're real clear what he knew. And so here was Gideon's identity. He says, how can I save Israel? His nationality was Israel. He was part of the nation of Israel. That was his culture. That was his heritage. That was his religion. We know from the narrative that he was from the tribe of Manasseh. Manasseh was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he says this. He says, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. And so the clans were the subgroups of the tribes. And he says, mine is the weakest in the whole bunch. And of course, if you do some reading there, you'll discover that he was part of the clan of Abiezer. That was probably a grandfather or great-grandfather, and they carried and shared that family name. And then he says, and then I am the least in my father's house. And so his family name, it was Joash. His father was Joash. So we very clearly know who he was. And so this idea of clans and families, large families, is super important in Scripture. We often overlook it. We don't recognize how important it is. And every one of you has an identity, something like Gideon's. And I know some of you are thinking, well, when I ask the question, who is your clan, you think to yourself, well, I don't think I have a clan. And my answer to you is, yes, you actually do have a clan, and I'm going to help you identify that today. Some of you remember a few months ago, I introduced you to something called the Dunbar's number. And Robin Dunbar, he's a sociologist. Here it is on the screen. You've seen it before. And he talked about how the fact that cognitively we are only capable of maintaining about 150 meaningful relationships. We can know many people and have acquaintances and recognize faces. But when it comes to sort of the group of people that would be part of our meaningful relationships, it's somewhere around approximately 150, from 100 to 200, depending on the person, right? And so if you want to know, if I ask the question, who's your clan, you're thinking, I'm not sure who my clan is. Here's your clan. Next time you're at a family wedding, look around the room. That is your clan. That is your clan. That's who you invite. They're the people that are important enough to you that you invite them. And who will be there? Well, they'll be your immediate family, and they'll be your extended family. And there will be your friends, your close friends. There'll be your church friends. There'll be your work friends, a few of them. There'll be a few neighbors. And these are the people that really matter to you. And of course, there's always that crazy uncle that you have to invite. Nobody really wants him there, but he's there. You know the one, right? How many of you have that crazy uncle? How many are that crazy uncle? The crazy uncle, he's the one who gets super drunk at the wedding and throws up on the dance floor. That's him. So hopefully that's not you. And so we all have this. And here's the cool thing about being a pastor. As a pastor, we do weddings all the time, and therefore we go to weddings all the time, and we're more exposed to it than most people. I've done literally dozens and dozens of weddings, and of course been to them. Nothing like Aubrey, though. Pastor Aubrey is the champion. He's done hundreds. What are you at, 300, 400, 800? 200, yeah. 200? Yeah. Oh, I told people last night it was 350. Okay. But anyway, it's 200 weddings. It's a lot of weddings. My mother refers to Pastor Aubrey as marrying Sam. Most of you don't know who that is, but that's from Little Abner. I'll show you the picture. Little Abner, he was the preacher in Dogpatch, and he married everybody. And you look at that picture, he's a little short, but there's some similarities, Aubrey. You need the hat. And so here's what happens when you go to these weddings. I get to see who everybody else's clan is. And I'm sitting at that table, and I'm looking around the room, and I'm going, I didn't realize. So here, and I see those church people, I see those family members. We were at a wedding one night. It still cracks me up when I think about it. And we got invited to sit at the table of the parents of the groom. And we sat at that table, and I was wondering, as we were going towards the table, I'm always wondering, who are the other two couples going to be? Right? And the other two couples, you ready for this? They were his accountant and his lawyer. And I thought, well, those are the people that are really important to him. That's interesting. You know, I did a wedding once of two lawyers, and they wanted to rewrite the vows. They did not want to say, I do. They instead said, we accept the terms and the conditions of the contract. And then there was the two nuclear scientists that I married. That was interesting. The bride was radiant, but the groom was positively glowing as well. And then I did the wedding of the two florists. It was a different story. That was an arranged wedding. I didn't know if you were going to boo me or not today for that. But it doesn't matter. I can entertain myself. I don't need your help. So we're looking at this question about, who is your clan? What is your clan? And we're trying to discover that. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at a passage that talks all about this. And again, it's probably one that you're fairly familiar with. It comes from the book of Nehemiah. And of course, we all know about this champion named Nehemiah. And Israel had been in captivity for 70 years to Babylon. And they finally got released from Babylon, and many of them had not returned to the city of Jerusalem. And when they got there, they were shocked by what they saw. And the gates were burned with fire, and the walls had tumbled down, and there was rubble everywhere. And Nehemiah really knew how to stir and to rally these people, which he did. And he got them all together, and they started working, and they built the walls up to half their height. Now, if you're gone from 70 years from your home, somebody else is likely to move into it or into the neighborhood, which is exactly what happened. And it names this group of people. There was someone named Sanballat and someone named Tobiah. There was the Arabs, there was the Ammonites, there was the Ashdodites. And there was these groups of people, and they all came together, every last one of them. They all came together to conspire against the Jews and stop them from re-inhabiting their city and reestablishing the walls in that city. And that was very, very discouraging for everybody. And everybody got discouraged, and they all ceased from their work. And there's this speech that Nehemiah gives them, and I want to share it with you. And it's in Nehemiah chapter 4. We're in verse 13 to 15. And here's what it says. It says, "Therefore I positioned the men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families." Take a wild stab at it. What word do you think he's using there? Yes, it's the word clans. He says, I set them in order according to their clan, their family groups, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose, and I said to the nobles, to the leaders and the rest of the people, here's his speech, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your homes." And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, every one to his work. Now here's my question for you. Why did he set them on the walls to fight according to their clans? I'll tell you why. Because people will fight for their family like no one else in this world. Isn't that true? You will fight. I mean, if you're fighting for a stranger, maybe that's one thing. If you're fighting for your nation, maybe that's another thing. But when you're fighting for your family, you will not give up. And he put them in close proximity. There was their uncles and their sons and their daughters and their cousins. And there were the people they were related to. There were their parents, their elderly parents. And he says, I want you to fight for your family. I want you to fight for your brothers and your sisters and for your mothers and your fathers. I want you to fight. And he understood this concept that we will fight for our families. And my point today, obviously, is that if there was ever a time we need to fight for our families, this is it. And you know what I love about this story, I love about this speech of Nehemiah's? It was all they needed. They just needed to be reminded what their battle was and who they were fighting against, and more importantly, who they were fighting for. And you know what comes to mind when I read this story? The movie Braveheart. How many of you have seen the movie Braveheart? I mean, it was a great movie. It came out in the 90s. Everybody thought the mullet was a thing of the 90s. And it was the 1290s, started with William Wallace. And here's the brief story. Understand that Braveheart is not an entirely true story, obviously, but there is some historical fact there. And what had happened, and this part of the story is true, was that Edward Longshanks had come in and conquered Scotland and was subjugating the people, and the Scots weren't very happy about that, as you can well imagine. And in the movie, he did two things, which was quite egregious. Number one, he started giving the English noblemen, Scottish lands, which was true. The second part, which may not be true, was that he gave them the right of prima nocta. And unless you know Latin, you're probably not familiar with that term. And what it meant was this. It's a terrible thing. And what it was the nobleman had the right to take any woman on her marriage night, on her wedding night, and violate her. I mean, can you imagine something worse? And so so understand this, that it was a direct attack on the family, right? That's what it was. I mean, how would that damage a family? But so anyway, that's part of the Braveheart story, whether it's true historically or not, neither here nor there. The point was that was what happened. And then, of course, without getting into too much detail, William Wallace's wife ends up being subjugated to that and ends up being murdered in the process of it. So now he's lost his wife. And so he becomes a man on a mission. He becomes the 13th century lethal weapon. Is what he just can always do that role, right? And there's nothing stopping him. There is no way he is ever going to give up this battle because of what he's lost and what is at risk and what is at fight. And we know this, that sure, he was fighting for his nation. And yes, he was fighting for his freedom. But more than anything else, he was fighting for the family. And here's what happens is that he gathers the clans together, and there they all are, those ragtag guys with sticks and picks and whatever else they're going to fight with. And he says, so are you willing to fight? And they go, no, we will run and we will live. And then comes his speech. And he says, aye, fighting you may die. Run and you will live, at least for a while. And then one day, dying on your bed, many years from now, would you be willing to trade all those days from this day to that for one chance, for just one chance to come back here and tell our enemies, you may take our lives, but you will never take our freedom? And at that, and thank you for the applause. And at that, they shout, Scotland forever, and they charge into battle. What did they need? They needed to be reminded that they had to fight for their families, just like Nehemiah did. And when I look at our world today, I see a war against the family. I see the family under siege. Maybe you don't see it. And I know I sound like a broken record on this, but I feel like our young people in particular, our next generation, is under siege. And they are being bombarded every single place they look. They are bombarded by social media, by news media, by pop culture, by the music industry, by TV, by radio, by movies, of course. And everything they're exposed to, virtually everything they're exposed to, undermines the fundamental nature of the family. It dishonors marriage. It dishonors family values. It dishonors fidelity and sexual morality. And they're being bombarded on every side. And if we don't fight for them, if we don't fight for this next generation, if we don't journey with them and communicate with them and help them figure out this complex and messed up world that they're living in, they will become victims of this world. Now, if you think I'm just blowing smoke here, let me show you a graph of something. I'm going to throw it up on the screen. It's just one factor of many. But here's one factor I want to show you. So 1940, this is a graph. They've charted the number of children that are born by percentage out of wedlock in North America. And in the 1940s, this number was extremely low, 3-4% of children were born out of wedlock in 1940. And today, the number is 40%. 40%. I want you to think about how high this number is. 40% of all children being born in North America today are being born out of wedlock. Isn't that a staggering number? And amongst the African Americans in the U.S., that number is 72%. These are shocking and stunning numbers that should frighten you. And in Canada, just in case we think we're somehow dodging this bullet, we are not. In Canada, the highest rate, the highest demographic group is the province of Quebec. It's 63% of all Quebecers are now being born out of wedlock. And in 1940, by comparison, it was the lowest number in all of North America. It was 2%. It was the lowest place. And that had to do with the social contract they had as Roman Catholics. They understood the value of marriage in 1940. And 2 or 3 generations later, they have abandoned their faith. And I'll tell you why. In the 1960s and 1970s, those of you who know your Canadian history, know that they went through something called the Quiet Revolution. And the Quebec governments made an intentional decision to secularize Quebec and to unhinge or uncouple them from the influence of the Catholic Church. And it took some time, but they were very successful in that today. And so, or in the process. And so today, if you look at Quebec, this is what you see. It's got the smallest number of Christians of anywhere in Canada, actually anywhere in the Western world. It's 1% of Quebecers are evangelical Christians. When you look, all the cathedrals, go to Montreal, Old Montreal, next time you're there, go look around. The cathedrals and the churches are all still there, but they're not churches. They're condominiums, they're restaurants, they're nightclubs, because the churches are closed as churches. And this has been the path that they've been on as a province, and consequently, we see what it's done to the family. And of course, most of you are familiar with Bill 21. Bill 21, of course, is the bill that, and it's law in Quebec, that you may not wear any kind of religious symbols in the public workplace if you work in a government agency, school, anything like that. And so that means if you're Jewish, you can't wear the kippah, you can't wear the niqab as a Muslim, you can't wear a turban as a Sikh, and if you're a Christian, you can't wear a crucifix or a cross. And you've been following this story. People are losing their jobs literally over this issue. And it's gone all the way to the Quebec Supreme Court, which has upheld it. And the public opinion is in favor of this. They want to be a secularized society. My point in all of this is what has been the consequences? What has been the end game of that? And the end game of that is the family has suffered almost irrevocably. And as goes the family, I think probably most of you would agree with this, as goes the family, so goes the nation. And when we look at this experiment and where it's landed us today, we are really in a difficult place. And that's why we have to be willing to fight for the family. Now, I want to take a few moments. This is going to seem a little different to you, but you don't mind different for me, do you? I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical journey through the history of the family. And most of you probably don't recognize this, but in most of history, people did not live in nuclear families like we sort of see as the norm today. The family was actually the extended family. It always existed through history. There was no really such thing as the nuclear family. Families were these large family groups, these clans like I talked about, and the grandparents were there, and the cousins were there, and the uncles were there, and the aunts were there. And they may not have necessarily lived in one home, but they lived in the same, proximity, and they worked together, and they lived together, and they worshiped together, and they did life together. And this is who they were and what they were. And we have this powerful misconception about these families from reading stories like Abraham and Sarah. We're all very, very familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah, and this is how you imagine it. When people preach on it, you imagine poor Abraham and Sarah sitting alone in their house, just the two of them, bored to tears, at 75 years old, at 85 years old, at 95 years old, and right up until he was 100 years old and the birth of Isaac. And they say, well, he had one nephew, his name was Lot, and Lot went and moved away to Sodom. Do you have any idea how inaccurate that story is? It's profoundly inaccurate. Let me just remind you of a little verse. It's Genesis chapter 14. So here's the story. So you had these, there was kings in each of these cities. They had these little kingdoms, these little city kingdoms. And each one of these cities had a king. And 4 of these kings attacked 5 of these kings. And one of the cities that got taken was the city of Sodom. And that's where Lot lived, Abraham's nephew. And they took Lot away. And he got captured. And when Abraham heard about this, he decided he was going to go after him and bring back his nephew. And go read it for yourself. It's Genesis 14:14, and it says, and Abraham took 318 trained men who had been born in his house. Did you catch that? Him and Sarah weren't having any children, but somebody was. Somebody in his household. There was 318 young men, plus women, plus others that were born in his household, that were born in his clan. He was not bumping around in some house, just him and Sarah pining away because they had nobody around them. That wasn't the point. They didn't have their own flesh and blood as children, but they had all kinds of people all around them. And that's the picture that we sometimes forget about. The biblical family was the extended family. And of course, here's the strength of the extended family, historically, was that it was very stable and it was very resilient. And think about this. Imagine this. If somebody got sick, if somebody died, guess what? There was people to fill the gap. Last night after the service, I had a man in our church was born in the Caribbean, and he came and he said his mother died when he was 6 years old. But he said our aunts lived in our house, and he says, I never knew I grew up without a mother. He said, they disciplined me, they bossed me around, they took care of me. He said, I did not know I was motherless because I had 2 or 3 of them living with us. Isn't that a crazy story? So that's the picture of the extended family of the past. And here's what happened. We have the Industrial Revolution happen. And these extended families where people were, their jobs were no longer on the farms. They were no longer in the rural areas. Where were they? They were in the factories of the city. And so people left their clans, they left their extended families, and they went to the city. And these young men were moving there all by themselves very often. And now they were alone, and they were separate from their family. And they got lonely in those environments, and they started to get married to the women that were there at a younger age than they would have before and starting their own families. And they ended up starting what we today would call the nuclear family. And that's where it was really birthed. And you know, there's strength and weaknesses of both of these. As I said, you've got, you know, the weakness of the nuclear family is this, is that it's brittle. And if something goes wrong, where is the buffer? Where is the cushion? Who's to take care of? Whereas when you look at the extended family is stable and is resilient, but it has its downsides too, right? It's going to be chaotic. It's going to be crowded. You're not going to have any privacy. You know, I grew up, I had friends down the street from us, the O'Neills, that grew up right down the street from us. O'Neill, they're Irish Catholics. They had 12 kids. There was 14 people living in one 3-bedroom house. And one of them went to school with me. Actually, one of them went to school with everybody because they had 12 kids. There was one in every single grade, right? And I remember he used to ask, I said, what's it like living in that house? He said, oh, it's not so bad. I try to be the last one home at night so I can sleep on the top of the pile. First one up in the morning, I get the shoes. And you know, I grew up like many of you did in a nuclear family, so it was a little bit different. But we had our moments because in the summer, we had a summer cottage that the family owned together. And in the summer, we would have everybody show up at the same time because the summer is very short. July is very short. Everybody came to the lake at the same time. So all of a sudden, you've got grandma there and grandpa there, and you've got the uncles and you've got the aunts and you've got the cousins. And now we're no longer 7 people or 8 people. We're now 25 or sometimes 30. And people are sleeping everywhere. And the kids are sleeping on the floor or they're sleeping outside in the tents. And you know, when you're a kid, you don't care. If I sleep on the floor in a sleeping bag with my cousins, that sounds like a party to me. There's nothing wrong with that. I never gave any thought to who was making all the food. I'm pretty sure, Mom, who was doing that? Somebody was making the food. Somebody was doing the dishes. But I know one thing, it weren't me. And here's what happened in a situation like that, was we'd all eat together. And I have a family of extroverts. You're probably surprised by that. And a family of extroverts. And this is what you had to do. If you're going to communicate at the dinner table, you had to talk louder than the other guy to be heard. And so it just escalated like this, and pretty soon it became thunderous. And most people don't believe this. I'm the quiet one in my family. I tell people that, and they don't believe that until they meet my family. And one day I had some friends show up, and he was my good friend, and he had just been married, and he brought his new bride to the lake one weekend, one of those crowded weekends. And she sat through one of those evening dinner meals where people were yelling their ruddy heads off. And at the end of the weekend, she turned to her husband and she said, will you do me a favor? And he said, sure. She says, don't ever bring me here again. All right, truth be told, it wasn't my friend's wife, it was my wife. So what happened with the extended family is, because of the Industrial Revolution, it broke down into the nuclear family. And the nuclear family was brittle, or it was fragile, and if something went wrong, and see, something did go wrong. It actually worked for a while, and then about the 1970s, people couldn't afford, most people could not afford the nuclear family anymore. And the wife had to go out to work, or maybe she wanted to go out to work, and that was very much part of, the self-determination and actualization of those days. And so that's what happened. And then, of course, you got these kids kind of left to themselves. I remember growing up in the 60s and 70s, me and my buddies, we roamed the streets like a pack of dogs. I never knew where my parents were. I worried about them. And and what happened, of course, is we got into drugs and we got into alcohol, and the teenage girls got pregnant. You all know this. You all have seen this picture. And then the divorce rate went to 50%, which it still is at today. And the consequence of that, when these families started to break down, there was no cushion. There was no buffer because there was no extended family anymore. Now, I want to show you a picture, a little picture, because we've all landed somewhere now. And I'm going to throw this up. And I'm not making any commentary on any of these. I'm just sort of trying to draw a picture for you to see that we all live somewhere like this. There are lots of people that still live in the extended family today, particularly in cultures, other places in the world. But as they come here, they may still live like that. And we have people in our church that live like that. They live within the extended family. And what happened to it was it decentralized, as I just told you the story, and became the nuclear family, which is Homer and Marge and their 2.5 children. That's the typical family. And then as that broke down, as we saw starting in the 70s, then you all know the consequences of that, and we ended up with a lot of single families. The fastest growing segment of our population is the single family. And you've got the matrifocal or the patrifocal, meaning a single father or a single mother. And then what happened is some of those families came together in blended families, and we have many of those in our own church where people have come together and they found a relationship. And then there's, of course, what they're now calling the chosen family, where people aren't necessarily connected by blood or by marriage, but they've chosen to live together as a family in some unique relationship like Charlie Sheen did in 2.5 Men. I think he was the half man, by the way. But that's just my commentary on it. And so here's my point. As I put that up, there's no judgment on anybody where you might have ended up or landed. And it may have been no fault of your own. That's just where we've all lived. We all live in one of those 5 versions of this. The question I have for you, and where I'm landing this today, is what are we going to do about that? And I'm not suggesting that we try to turn back the clock and we all see if we can go join a Hutterite colony somewhere, or maybe an old school Mennonite colony, which still exists as well. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying what we need to do is think, who is my clan? That's my question. Who is my clan? And this is what Mother Teresa said, and I love this quote. She said, the problem with the world is we draw the circle of our family too small. And my challenge to you, the take home for you today, is how do we draw the circle of our family bigger? How do we do that? What does that look like? And I've got a fantastic verse for you that illustrates this from the life of no other than Jesus. Do you remember him? And here's the verse. It's Mark chapter 3, verse 31. It says, then his brothers and his mother, this is the biological version of them, his brothers and his mother came. Standing outside, they sent to him, calling him, and a multitude was sitting around him. So the reason the mother and brothers couldn't get in, because he was surrounded by a crowd of people. The house was crowded. It was packed. They couldn't get anywhere near. And they said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. But he answered them, saying, listen to this, it's so fantastic. Who is my mother or my brothers? And he looked around in a circle at those who sat about him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Did you catch that? Jesus looked at this group of people, followers of Christ, and he looked around in a circle and he said, here are my brothers and my mother. Here is my family. What did he do? He literally drew the circle of his family bigger. And the challenge for every one of us is to do that. And you, of all people, have the greatest opportunity to do this. You know why? Because you're part of a church. We are part of this church that believes in relationship and family. And as I look around this room, I see people that I consider family. Many, many of you. I look at this and I think, there are my brothers, and there is my mother, literally. and I look around this room and I think it's amazing how God has thrust us together from different walks of life and different parts of the world, and he has caused us to be family. Now, bear with me 2 more minutes. I need to tell you a story in closing. How many of you have seen the movie The Blind Side with Sandra Bullock? How many have seen that movie? Most of you in the room have seen that movie. I love this movie. Sandra Bullock won Best Actress for it. She won every Best Actress award there was for it. She did a marvelous job. And it's the story of this family, the Towies. They live in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was very successful. Sean, the father, was very successful. He owned 60 restaurants at the time. He owns 85 today. Very successful, well-to-do family. And his wife, Leanne, was just a real firecracker. And they were at a volleyball game at their kids' school one night in Memphis, and there was this very large, like when I say very large, 6'4", 300-pound black boy that was going through the stands at the end of the game, searching for uneaten food like hot dogs or French fries and eating them. And so they asked their kids about this boy, and they said, yeah, he comes to school here. He wears the same clothes every single day. And so they had a mental note of this. And then about A few days later, Leanne is driving home, and she sees him in the same T-shirt, walking down the road at night by himself, ill-dressed for the temperature, and he's shivering and cold, and she pulls over and says, "Where are you going?" Turns out he had nowhere to go. And his father had recently passed away, and his mother was a drug addict, and he literally had nobody taking care of him, and he had nobody feeding him, and nobody clothing him, and he literally had nowhere to go. And so she said, "You're coming home with me," this little diminutive blonde lady. "You're coming home with me." And this big kid got in a car with her, and they brought him home, and he slept on the couch that night. And then they gradually continued to reach out with him more and more, and he kind of became part of their family, and they invited him to Thanksgiving, and they invited him to Christmas. And I'm going to show you one picture here. This picture on the left is the true picture. They took him to see Santa Claus. Yeah, he fits nicely in there with Santa Claus. And then, of course, the one on the right is the actual movie, Sandra Bullock, and the actor who played Michael Oher was his name. And he became part of this family. And he clearly had potential to play football because of his size, but he was academically ineligible because his grade point average was .76. So Leanne starts to work with him and brings his grade point average up to 2.52. He starts playing, and he's not playing nearly like he should. And one of the things on the test, he scored only 80 on his IQ test. But one of the things he scored particularly high on was the protective instinct. And he would always protect people. And so Leanne goes, and I love this little picture here from the movie, and she's pointing at him, and she's saying, "You need to protect your quarterback because these people are trying to hurt him." And so she instilled that into him, and he became a man with a fire after that. And he became this incredible offensive lineman. And then, of course, to wrap the story up, he gets recruited to university, graduates. I mean, I love this picture. Again, the reality and the movie. And he out of university, he gets drafted to the Baltimore Ravens. Are you ready for this? His first contract was a 5-year contract for $13.8 million. And in 2013, he helps the Baltimore Ravens win the Super Bowl. Got a picture of that. And these are the real Towies, the real parents that adopted him, Sean and Leanne. And I love this story so much because it's a picture of this kid who was lost in this world because he had no family and it had broken and it had crumbled. And he was so full of potential. But not without a family, not without people that loved him and cared enough about him to bring him in and help nurture and develop that potential so he could become everything that he was meant to be. And the reason it happened is because a Christian couple, you probably figured that part out, was willing to draw the circle of their family bigger to include someone else, and by doing so, transformed and revolutionized their life. So my question for you is, who is your clan? Maybe it's time to draw the circle of our family bigger. Let's stand together. I'm going to take a moment with every head bowed and every eye closed like we always do in this church, and for those online, just to listen very carefully. And it's all about being part of this family of God. And that's what Jesus indicated when he looked around in a circle. Love that picture. And he's looking around in that circle right now. And he wants you to be his child. He wants you to be a child of God. He wants to invite you into his family. And if you've never invited Christ into your life to be your Lord and Savior, that's where it begins. And so if you're here today and you have not begun that journey, or maybe you knew him in the past and you've slipped away, it's time for you to come back. And I'm not going to single you out. I'm going to call you forward. I'm not going to ask you to say anything publicly. But with every eye closed, with every head bowed, if you want to be part of the family of God, I want you to raise your hand right now so I can see it. Just take a moment so I can see it. And when I've seen it, you can put your hand down. For those of you online, I want you to just click on that little tab that shows the hand there. And that's your way of indicating it. So I said I wouldn't single anybody out, so we're all going to pray this together. You ready? Are you going to pray with me? Online and in person here. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you for the work of the cross, that you died for my sin, you rose again on the third day, and you forever live to be my Lord. That you have welcomed me into your family. I am now a child of God, and I am part of a family, a bigger family that I didn't have before, but is now mine. In Jesus' name, amen.